You're listening to Why Islam is True with Shaykh Hamza Karamali. Join Shaykh Hamza on this podcast series as he logically analyzes the claim Islam is true by examining evidence for and against it. As he does so, he explains the relationship between Islam and science and Islam and the other faiths. He also explores the arguments of the atheists, the nature of life and death, and ultimately, the purpose of human existence. This podcast is brought to you by Seekers Hub Global. You can subscribe to this podcast and all of our other podcasts on iTunes, Google Play, and on our website, seekershub.org/podcast. Visit seekershub.org for free online courses, our reliable answer service, and engaging media.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. In the previous presentation, I began to explain why the claim that the universe began to exist is evidence for the existence of God. I explained that there are two kinds of evidence for the truth of this claim. The first is scientific evidence. The second is philosophical evidence. In the previous presentation, I explained the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. I first explained several paradoxes that arise from imagining that the universe does not have a beginning. And then I explained that scientists have resolved these paradoxes by abandoning the position that the universe does not have a beginning, based on evidence such as the redshift and the general theory of relativity, which indicate that the universe is expanding and therefore had a beginning, and which is confirmed by the observation of cosmic background microwave radiation, as well as by many other observations regarding the evolution, size, and composition of the universe. That the universe has a finite age, or in other words, that it began to exist, is now accepted as scientific fact. In this presentation, I will focus on the second kind of evidence, the philosophical evidence. This evidence is now part of what contemporary philosophers call the Kalam Cosmological Argument for the existence of God. The word Kalam, remember, is the Arabic name for traditional Islamic theology. Contemporary philosophers formulate the Kalam Cosmological Argument like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. This is the beginning of the argument. The completion of the argument reasons from the conclusion of this argument to the existence of God. This is in fact how the Muslim theologian Ghazali formulated the argument about 1,000 years ago, and this formulation is taken almost verbatim from him. An important difference, however, is the use of the word cause. When Ghazali formulated this argument just under 1,000 years ago, he didn't use the expression cause, but the expression something that made it exist. The Arabic word for this is muhdith. The two expressions are different. Ghazali's expression is more general. A cause is something that is inert, lifeless, necessary. A cause is not a free agent. It does not have any volition. Fire, for example, is a cause of burning. This means that it is not a volitional agent that chooses to burn or not to burn. It simply burns. God, however, is not a necessary cause. God is a volitional agent with free will. I will show in a future presentation that the Kalam Cosmological Argument, as well as the argument from contingency that I presented earlier, all show that the universe was not brought into existence by some inert and lifeless cause. Rather, it was created by a volitional agent who freely chose to bring the universe into existence. God, in other words. Ghazali's expression, something that made it exist, is therefore a more accurate expression than cause, because it does not rush to the conclusion that the thing that made the universe is an inert cause. Instead, it suspends judgment on whether that thing is an inert and lifeless cause or whether it is a volitional agent with free will, concluding simply that the universe has something that made it exist. We'll therefore work with Ghazali's form of the argument. Now, the key premise in this argument is the second one, that the universe began to exist. Theologians and philosophers in the Western tradition have traditionally believed that the fact that the universe began to exist could not be proven by any rational argument. This is why, although Thomas Aquinas argued for God's existence from the contingency of the universe, he never formulated an argument from the fact that the universe began to exist. Like other Christian philosophers, all influenced by ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, Aquinas believed that the fact that the universe began to exist could only be discovered by faith in Scripture, not by any rational argument. In the Muslim theological and philosophical traditions, however, the argument from creation was even more popular than the argument from contingency. It was most famously formulated just under 1,000 years ago by Ghazali, and it is his formulation that is inspiring this presentation. But Ghazali was not the first to formulate the argument. He was preceded by dozens of other theologians, the most prominent of whom were his teacher Abdul Malik al-Juwayni, the renowned theologian and debater Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, and the founder of traditional Islamic theology Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. It is not surprising at all that so many Muslim theologians presented this argument, because, just like the argument from contingency, it was first presented in the Qur'an itself. The verse that I have cited so frequently in my presentations, for example, cites at its very beginning that the creation of the heavens and the earth, the fact that they began to exist, in other words, is one of the great signs for the existence of God. And here are 20 other verses, a small sample of many, many others, that cite creation as evidence for God's existence and omnipotence. I'll leave you to look up these verses yourself. The arguments of the Muslim theologians and philosophers for the beginning of the universe were unknown to Western thinkers until the recent scientific discovery that the universe began to exist with the Big Bang. The discovery that the universe began to exist naturally led to discussions about the existence of God, and in 1979, Christian philosopher William Lane Craig published his book, The Kalam Cosmological Argument, drawing the Western world's attention to the rational arguments of the Muslim theologians for the beginning of the universe, and from there, for the existence of God. The argument has since been widely critiqued and defended by dozens of philosophers, scientists, and Christian theologians, earning a place for itself in the Western philosophical tradition as the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Kalam, remember, is the word for traditional Islamic theology. I will now explain this argument, beginning with this presentation and continuing on through the several presentations that come after this one. I present the argument as I think a Muslim theologian, such as Ghazali, might present it today. This presentation will differ in several ways from many Western presentations of the argument. These differences make the argument clearer, more to the point, and more complete than its modern versions. But before I begin, I want to emphasize that the fact that the universe began to exist is obvious and intuitive. Muslim theologians went to great lengths to refute the arguments of those who claimed that the universe had no beginning. If I simply present their arguments with all of their complexities without showing first that their claim doesn't even need an argument, you might mistakenly imagine that they were trying to prove something that is very difficult to prove. Ghazali himself noted this almost 1,000 years ago, prefacing one of his responses to an unreasonable opponent with the comment that, quote, "Going to great lengths to prove things that are clear obscures them instead of clarifying them." The reason why it is obvious that the universe began to exist is that everything that you or I experience in the universe has an age, which is another way of saying that it began to exist a finite period of time ago. Let's look, for example, at the Qur'anic verse that we have seen so many times in these presentations. It begins by mentioning the heavens and the earth, which, according to modern arguments, have a finite age. I showed the scientific reasoning for this in the previous presentation. It then mentions the night and day. Every night that we have experienced begins to exist at sunset and lasts until dawn. Every day that we have experienced begins to exist at dawn and then lasts until sunrise. Then it mentions the ships that sail the sea. Every ship that we've experienced began to exist when it was constructed. Every sailing passage that every ship has ever made across the sea began to exist when the ship left its dock and set sail towards its destination. Every wave in the sea that has ever splashed against the hull of any ship that has ever sailed began to exist. Every profit that humans have ever made from their trading voyages began to exist when they sold their goods for higher prices than they bought them for. every drop of rain that has ever fallen from the sky began to exist when water vapor from the seas condensed into droplets of water. Every plant that has ever sprouted forth from the earth began to exist. Every animal that has ever existed began to exist when it was born. Every wind that blows began to exist. Every cloud that we have ever seen in the sky began to exist. Everything that we experience in the universe began to exist. If everything that we experience in the universe has an age and began to exist a finite period of time ago, then the universe as a whole too must have an age and must have begun to exist. The claim that the universe began to exist is straightforward, intuitive, and a simple generalization of our everyday experience. The claim that the universe did not begin to exist, that it has existed for an infinitely long period of time, whatever that means, is strange, counterintuitive, and contrary to everything that we experience. We have never seen anything existed forever, nor, as I will show shortly, will we ever see such a thing. It is perfectly reasonable to conclude that the universe has an age and began to exist, and it is stubbornly unreasonable to conclude that the universe does not have an age and never began to exist. But there is a problem. The problem is that there is always some atheist philosopher who will object that it is perfectly possible for the universe to have existed forever. If I simply dismiss such philosophers' claims as strange, counterintuitive, and unreasonable, which in fact they are, you might imagine that I am avoiding their arguments. To dispel that imagination, I will now proceed to show you why their arguments are flawed and incoherent. Some of the arguments that I will present in this presentation and the next one might get a bit complex. I want you to keep in mind throughout, however, that the reason for the complexity of my responses is not that it is difficult to show that the universe began to exist. Rather, the reason for their complexity is that the atheists who object to the claim that the universe began to exist often conceal the flaws of their arguments with complex concepts in order to give the misleading impression that this is a claim that is too complex for the average thinking person to evaluate on his own. In this presentation, I want to remove this misleading impression and show you that you can, in fact, evaluate the claim on your own and easily come to your own independent conclusion that this claim is absurd and false. The first step is for you to see that the claim, the universe did not begin to exist, the atheist claim, is logically equivalent to two other claims. It is logically equivalent to the claim that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time. The reason why it is logically equivalent to this claim is that to claim that the universe did not begin to exist is to claim that if you go back in time from the present moment, there is no point in time that was not preceded by another point in time. And the quantity of time that has passed before the present moment is infinite. Or, to put it more clearly, it is endless. It has no end. And that is the same thing as saying that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time. This second claim, in turn, is logically equivalent to a third claim, namely, the claim that an infinite quantity of time has elapsed. The reason why the second claim is equivalent to this third claim is because to claim that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time is to claim that there is no beginning to the quantity of time in the backward direction, but that it has nevertheless reached the present moment. That is to say that an infinite or endless quantity of time has elapsed. That's the third claim. Now, since all of these claims are logically equivalent, if any one of them is false, then the other two must also be false. I will now take each one of these claims in turn and show you why they are false, beginning from the bottom with the last claim. You can see the falsehood and absurdity of this claim by reflecting on what exactly it means. The word infinite in the phrase an infinite quantity of time means endless. And the present perfect tense verb has elapsed means has come to an end. The statement an infinite quantity of time has elapsed therefore means an endless quantity of time has come to an end. This is a plain contradiction in terms, because it is not possible for something that does not end to come to an end. The claim is self-contradictory. Since this claim is logically equivalent to the other two claims, its absurdity and falsehood entails the absurdity and falsehood of the other two claims as well. However, I will now proceed to consider each of the other two claims independently and show you why they are absurd and false on their own. I will begin with the second claim, that the universe has existed for an infinite quantity of time. This claim is absurd because an infinite quantity of anything is absurd. Grasping the absurdity of an infinite quantity of anything does not require any philosophical training. It can be grasped by a 5-year-old child. Consider the following scenario. Umar and Mary, two 5-year-olds, are arguing over who broke Auntie Zubaida's window. Auntie Zubaida is their neighbor. Mary shouts, "You broke it." Umar refuses, "Did not." Mary insists, "Did too." Umar responds, "Did not." Did too, did not, did too, did not, did too, did not. Now, Mary has heard from someone that infinity is the biggest number of all. Seeing that the sequence of accusations and denials between her and Umar will continue unresolved, 5-year-old Mary makes her move to silence Umar by screaming at the top of her voice, "Did to infinity." Umar, also aware that infinity is the biggest number of all, immediately demonstrates the absurdity of the concept of the biggest number of all by responding, "Did not infinity plus 1. 5-year-old Umar has just shown that an infinite quantity of anything is an absurd concept. Let me clarify Umar's argument. Umar has observed that if infinity is a quantity, how much something is in other words, then you can add 1 to it. Mary is using infinity as a quantity. She is saying did to an infinite number of times. Since she is using infinity as a quantity, Umar can add 1 to it. But this immediately invalidates the very concept of infinity. Remember that infinity in this context means endless, and quantity means the amount or how much something is. If an infinite or an endless amount of something is a quantity, then you can add 1 to it. But if you can add 1 to it, then it is no longer endless, because in order to add 1 to anything, in order to increase it by 1, in other words, it needs to have an end relative to which that increase can take place. If it has no end, it cannot be increased, because any increase always takes place relative to some end. If something can be increased, then it must have had an end before the increase and an other end after the increase. Umar's straightforward and intuitive observation demonstrates that you cannot have an infinite quantity of anything, because if something is a quantity, then it can be increased. And if it can be increased, then it has an end. And if it has an end, then it is not infinite. No quantity of anything can be infinite. And therefore, to return to our point of departure, it is not possible for the universe to have existed for an infinite quantity of time. Both the second and the third claims are absurd and false. I will now show you why the first claim is false. Consider any physical quantity. Let's take, for example, the number of orbits of any 2 planets around the Sun. Let's take Earth, which takes 1 Earth year to go around the Sun, and Mercury, which takes about 1/4 of an Earth year to go around the Sun. After 1 Earth year, Earth will have completed 1 orbit around the Sun, and Mercury will have completed 4. After 2 years, Earth will have completed 2 orbits around the Sun, and Mercury 8. After 3 years, Earth will be at 3, Mercury at 12, and so on. At any given time, the number of orbits of Mercury will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. After 1 year, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. After 2 years, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. After 3 years, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth, and so on. After any number of years, say n, it will be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth, or in other words, 4n. Now, if this first claim is true, if it is true that the universe has no beginning, then the number of orbits of Mercury is infinite. remember that infinite means endless. And the number of orbits of Earth is also infinite. Remember again that infinite means endless. But we know that the number of orbits of Mercury is always greater than the number of orbits of Earth by a factor of 4. And the only way for the orbits of Mercury to be greater than the number of orbits of Earth by a factor of 4 is for the number of orbits of Earth to have a beginning and an end, and for the number of orbits of Mercury to have a beginning and an end, and for the number of orbits of Mercury to be 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. If the number of orbits of both are endless, infinite, then it is not possible to say that any one of them is greater than the other one. If the first claim here is therefore false. It is false because it entails that any two physical quantities that are increasing at different rates are the same after the passage of an infinite period of time. Even though at any given point in time, remember, if you take at any given point in time, you compare the number of orbits of Earth with the number of orbits of Mercury, at any given point in time, the quantity that is increasing faster is always greater than the quantity that is increasing more slowly. Let's recap what I have shown in this presentation. I began by saying that even though there is clear scientific evidence that the universe began to exist, the fact that the universe began to exist can also be demonstrated philosophically without recourse to the discoveries of modern science. I showed first that the claim that the universe began to exist is straightforward, intuitive, and a simple generalization of our everyday experience, and that the opposite claim, that the universe did not begin to exist, is strange, counterintuitive, and contrary to our everyday experience. I then formally demonstrated the absurdity of this opposite claim by showing that it is plainly absurd for an infinite, i.e. an endless quantity of time to elapse, i.e. end, because it is self-contradictory. Then by showing that any quantity can always be increased, which necessarily entails that it has an end and that it is not infinite. And finally, by showing that the fact that the universe did not begin to exist entails that two physical quantities that are increasing at different rates are equal, even though at every point in time they are actually different. Remember, at every point in time, the number of orbits of Mercury is 4 times the number of orbits of Earth. There are, in fact, many more arguments that illustrate the contradictions that are entailed by the claim that the universe did not begin to exist, both in the Muslim theological tradition and now, thanks to the work of philosophers such as William Lane Craig, also in the Western tradition. The idea, however, is very simple, straightforward, and intuitive to grasp. Anything that exists in the universe must be finite. To say otherwise is incoherent, self-contradictory, and entails a host of contradictions. There remains, however, one problem that I have not yet addressed, and that is the problem of the mathematical concept of infinity. I will, God willing, show in the next presentation that this mathematical concept is an imaginary concept that has no bearing on any of the arguments that I have presented here. In the process, I will also, God willing, show you additional philosophical arguments for the fact that the universe undoubtedly began to exist. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Thank you for listening to Why Islam is True with Shaykh Hamza Karam Ali. If you like this podcast, we'd appreciate if you left us a review on iTunes and Google Play. Help Seekers Hub spread the light of guidance to millions around the world by supporting us through monthly donations by going to seekershub.org/donate. Your donations are tax deductible in the US and Canada.